I'm Naomi Fuller and I'm here from Playing Out. We are, as Antonia said, a Bristol-based organisation, and I'm going to talk again very briefly about the possibilities of creating streets as places for play and for social interaction, and it's kind of moving on from the idea of the livability, which Lorraine was talking around, centred around buildings, but looking at the street space in particular. And I'm going to talk about how we are now supporting residents across the country to make changes in the streets where they live. So my starting point is really that streets originally were public spaces, used in a manifold, many different ways by different groups. And they lent themselves to play, and they lent themselves to social contact by adults, and this kind of slightly sepia tone nostalgic view of streets was the norm until relatively recently, say 20 years ago. It was a normal sight to see children, perhaps not in breeches, but certainly children playing in the streets where they lived. And it's only over time that streets have become dominated by one group and really for one purpose, namely by traffic and for the purpose of driving and parking. And I should just say we're talking here about residential streets, the places where people live, not commercial streets, not arterial routes and so on. So this erosion of uses and rights or people's sense of having a right to use their streets in different ways has happened over time and almost without an awareness. So the space was always there, but there are now several barriers, both visible and invisible, to people using them regularly for play and for social contact. So fast forwarding to residential streets today, they often lurch between this. You know, clearly traffic is there, very present. It makes crossing a road fairly anxiety-inducing. But the other end of the spectrum is that they can often spend many hours of the day looking like that. Really the habit, an underused resource and the habitat of parked cars and pigeons. But I think the fact of the former image, i.e. the knowledge that cars can whip down your residential street at speed and use it as a rat run, means that there is an invisible barrier up really all the time for most streets, for most people. And so this street in the second photo is just as out of bounds to most people who live there, older people, children, families, as the former, with its more obvious encroachment of traffic, noise and presence. So Playing Out began as a one-off experiment in street intervention. Was it possible to reclaim this underused resource, which was already there in a meaningful way for residents? So two neighbours here in Bristol saw this street, their street, as a potential asset and wanted to try and unlock that asset. Their actions were very much a reaction to what they'd observed and experienced. So the issue of children not getting out enough, not having the independence to move freely around their street and neighbourhood, children being much more restricted, children being more used to indoor and perhaps sedentary activities, and also becoming more used perhaps to adult-led activities than using their own resources in the public spaces close to their homes, which is common as a memory for most adults today. But also the experience of adults living alongside each other in a relative state of isolation, that phenomenon of living in your street for 5 years and barely speaking to your neighbours is fairly common. So in the 7 years since these neighbours organised their first Playing Out session, Playing Out has become a flourishing resident-led movement of people who are wanting to do this and are starting to make changes on their street. And this is right across the country now. And Playing Out as an initiative sits amongst a whole host and a growing number of creative interventions, projects and ideas which are around making streets more pleasant, more livable and also more democratic. So since the germination of the idea in 2009, we've gone on to support residents in towns and cities across the UK. We're now a small, not-for-profit organisation. We've developed lots of free materials, a website of resources for people to use, and a step-by-step kind of model which takes you from having the initial idea to getting out there with your signs, takes you through what you need to do to organise regular Playing Out sessions. And I don't have time to go through that in detail, but a very quick whiz through. It all starts with dialogue, and that is the starting point for all of the changes that follow. and conversations with neighbours, testing out the idea, gathering views. And then there's a period of more formal consultation with residents and also getting permission from the local authority, presuming you live in an area with a policy, and I'll touch on that very briefly in a minute. But permission varies. Here in Bristol, which was the trailblazing area, residents can apply for sessions up to once a week for up to 3 hours at a time through a one-off annual application. And then there's some preparation to do. It's about making sure there are enough neighbours to volunteer as stewards, doing a simple risk assessment and telling everyone on the street about how it will work on the day. And then there's some setting up. There's some road closed signage involved and cones and all of that kind of thing. Your stewards need to be briefed, ready to divert traffic and guide any residents in who absolutely need car access during the session. But the rest is up to the children and the adults. You know, it's about free play, it's about sharing toys and games. The play is not led by adults, it's about giving the children that space. And to some adults, maybe they think a strip of grey tarmac is a really poor play space, but the evidence is the opposite. Children seem to find limitless possibilities once they're given permission to get out there and play. So the model has now been used in, that we know of, 350 streets across the UK. That means there have been around about 3,500 street play sessions involving 10,000 children and about 4,500 adults stewarding, helping to organise and being involved. And in terms of measuring the sort of energy, commitment and time given by residents to this idea, which is quite a difficult thing to measure, we estimate that over 30,000 kind of volunteer hours have been spent by people doing this on their own street. And I think that really shows just what a kind of live idea it is. So moving on to what's happened, what's been needed to create this change. I think there are three main things that have had to be put in place. This is the first and most obvious one. It's about the physical barriers, the visible change in the status quo, a sign that to drivers approaching things are different. Second is the permission, the actual legal policy permission, the sense that a local authority has said this is okay for you to do, and that's been an important, this very dull and boring piece of bureaucracy has actually opened up streets for play, first in Bristol and then elsewhere, because many local authorities copied what Bristol did, and they based this on a very archaic piece of Victorian legislation, the Town and Police Clauses Act of 1847. But that's been the basis for street play sessions across the country. And thirdly, and I think importantly, is a new or renewed sense of permission or legitimacy in actually using your street in a different way, and daring to step into it with a skipping rope, daring to make a mark on the road surface with chalk. And I think that what Playing Out has done is not invent that desire in people, but perhaps unlock a dormant desire to be able to go and use that street that you live in. In terms of benefits, I think for most people in the room it would be quite self-evident that there is a health and well-being benefit for children if they're allowed to run around and burn off their energy and play freely in that space which is normally out of bounds. They gain practical skills like learning to ride a bike safely, learning to roller skate, but there are also a whole host of invisible social skills which are around assessing risk, building confidence, learning how to trust other adults in the street. But there's been some research done now by a team at University of Bristol actually measuring the physical activity levels of children during Playing Out sessions, and they've proved what you might imagine, which is that children are more active than they would have been normally. So playing out on the street during a Playing Out session actually replaces sedentary behaviour, not active behaviour. And they estimate that children spend around about 30% of their time during a session in what public health policy people and professionals call moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is, playing tag, getting red-faced and sweaty to you or I. But that's what the concern is around children's daily dose of this moderate to vigorous physical activity. And I could talk a bit more about the research that Dr. Angie Page, who's the lead researcher here, is the person to give some more detail on that. But what she's concluded from her studies is that temporary street closures are a scalable public health intervention and could be rolled out nationally and bring some of these health well-being benefits to all. But other benefits which are just as important, which residents themselves talk about, are building community, building social contact between neighbours, and also to some extent, and this is a bit of an emerging area, being more active, starting to participate more in local democracy, actually sticking your head above a parapet in your street, talking to your neighbours, having the confidence to get something like this off the ground, often gives people a taste of, I can make change, I have a sense in which my community issues matter more to me. And people have reported, attending local forums and using their voice more effectively. But there are several barriers that remain to this idea reaching all communities, and despite there being some really good early adopters amongst local authorities, and again hats off to Bristol for being the first, there are now around 40 local authorities with positive policies in place. There remains some confusion and some reluctance amongst local authorities about which policy to use to grant permission for street play road closures, or even about the worth of doing it in the first place. So we really want to try and understand this position more precisely and understand what would give more confidence or motivation to those councils. And another major barrier is around the prevailing cultural status, the status quo which we're all used to, which is really that pedestrians have a kind of submissive role on streets, and that cars and parking and driving dominate. So making your street a place to play can be very rewarding, but it can also be something which exposes you to some hostility, and it's not always easy. You have dared to designate your street as a place to be shared. You've dared to question the automatic rights of the driver. You've dared to dismantle on a temporary basis, we're just talking about maybe 2 or 3 hours at a time, that entrenched hierarchy which normally puts children's needs and children's rights as road users and users of public space at the bottom of a pyramid. You've suggested a different model, and that doesn't always go down very well. But for the longer term, in terms of how to dismantle these barriers, I mean, all of this intervention, all of the cones and the high-vis and the manual and the model was always intended as a means to an end, not an end in itself. And clearly we are some way off from that end, meaning that, street play could flourish in communities without the need for all of the organisation, and that could happen in a more spontaneous way. But I think that one thing I just want to end on is that through playing out, as well as the other creative projects and ideas that are out there live at the moment around making change close to people's homes in the streets where they live, I think people are starting to realise their own potential and their sense of agency. And I think that many people feel that the street where they live is more than just a public space. They have a more personal commitment and aspiration for their street than they may do to other bits of the public realm. And I'm just going to cite here, in the context of Bristol City Council's 20-mile-an-hour rollout, the team that were responsible for doing some market research came up with this notion of JIMBYism, which is the kind of more forward-looking cousin to NIMBYism. So JIMBYism is the just in my backyard mentality, which means that I actually have more investment in nurturing and cherishing and changing and improving that space right outside my front door. And I'm actually prepared to be flexible and maybe put my own more selfish interest to one side for that good. But the further I go from my front door, my street, that commitment wanes, and I quite like that notion of JIMBYism. It's certainly what's being displayed by all the residents that are getting behind the playing out idea. But just despite this energy, residents can only do so much. Councils are getting behind the idea of street play and supporting it, and supporting the whole notion of streets as places for play, social interaction and other uses. But they're doing it slowly, and they're doing it on a one-by-one basis, and there could be swifter change. I think there could be change if there was stronger support from government to unlock some of these policy barriers, but also to more vocally defend the rights of children to be in this public space in the first place and to be present in their streets. So I think the imperative now is that we hasten the change. We feel that we have got a role in supporting the momentum that residents have started, and that we support them in carrying on, sustaining the change that they've begun. So I thought a good place to end would be to sort of have this idea of longer term change, but expressed better than I could. This is the words of a Bristol street organiser who's been musing on what she's in it for. And she says here, you know, that she's dreaming ahead to a time when she can sit outside the front of her house as an old lady, watching kids playing and telling the stories about when cars are more important than people. So that's what we're hoping to achieve together with the residents that have started playing out across the country. So thank you very much. That was a really quick whistle-stop tour through playing out, but I'd be happy to talk more about it at the end if anyone has questions or thoughts. Thank you very much.